A judge mocked a black man's prayer. Seconds later, he broke down, crying. The courtroom held a suffocating stillness that morning, as though every breath taken was filtered through a layer of tension no one could name, but everyone could feel. A dim gray light poured through the narrow windows high above, casting cold shadows across the polished wood floor and flickering weakly against the varnished walls. Judge Ronald Weaver sat atop the bench like a figure carved from stone, expressionless, stiff, detached. His black robe hung around him like armor, his eyes scanning the courtroom with the clinical indifference of a man who'd long since stopped seeing the people in front of him as individuals. For nearly 2 decades, Weaver had presided over criminal hearings with a reputation for unflinching sternness, known not for compassion but for consistency, a man who upheld the law with the cold precision of a metronome. But on that particular day, something was about to challenge everything he thought he understood about justice, dignity, and the quiet strength of the human spirit. The defendant standing before him was Marcus Bell, a 52-year-old black man with weathered features that spoke of years of labor and hard-earned resilience. His posture was upright but restrained, and while there was weariness in his stance, there was also something unspoken, something unbreakable behind his eyes. Marcus wore a plain white shirt, slightly wrinkled from a night in holding, and scuffed shoes that had clearly walked many difficult miles. He had been called in for violating the technical terms of his parole, a charge that sounded severe on paper but lacked context in practice. His infraction? Missing a monthly parole officer meeting due to working double shifts at a mechanic shop to cover the rent increase on his one-bedroom apartment in a crumbling building where the elevator hadn't worked in years. To the system, it didn't matter that he was trying to survive. It didn't matter that he hadn't committed a crime in years. What mattered was that a checkbox wasn't marked. And now here he was. Another file, another docket number, another man standing alone in front of power. His public defender, young and overworked, barely met his eyes as she handed over his paperwork. No character witness, no plea for leniency, just a motion to proceed. When the bailiff announced the charge, a low murmur ran through the room, and Judge Weaver cleared his throat. He leaned forward slightly, peering at Marcus with a practiced, almost dismissive gaze. "Mr. Bell," he said, his tone as dry as the paper he held, "do you have anything to say before I deliver sentencing?" There was no sarcasm yet, just the cold efficiency of a man who had made the same request 1,000 times before and expected silence or excuses. But Marcus didn't rush to answer. Instead, he paused, took a slow breath, and in a gesture so soft it felt like a whisper against the tension in the room, he bowed his head. His hands, scarred and strong, came together in front of him, not with theatrical flair, but with reverent calm. And then, in a voice that trembled not with fear, but with raw humility, he began to pray. "Lord," he said, his voice barely rising above the sound of the heating vents, "you know my heart. You know I ain't perfect, and you know how many times I've stumbled. But you also know I've tried every day to walk straight, to be better than I was. You've seen me working nights, trying to keep a roof over my head, trying to earn, not steal, every dollar. I know you saw me when nobody else did. I ain't asking you to change what's coming. I just ask that you stay beside me while it happens." The room, for a fleeting moment, felt suspended in time. Even the sound of shuffling papers had ceased. A few heads lowered, a few faces turned. It wasn't the prayer of a desperate man begging for escape. It was the quiet confession of someone who had made peace with the weight of his life, but wasn't going to surrender his dignity. But the reverence of the moment didn't last. A sharp, dry chuckle cracked through the stillness like glass underfoot. Judge Weaver leaned back in his chair, the smirk on his face unmistakable. "Mr. Bell," he said with biting sarcasm, "this isn't a church pew. It's a courtroom. We're here for justice, not spiritual theatrics. You want to pray, you do that in private. In here, we deal with facts, not fairy tales. Your record shows a parole violation. That's the reality. Your little conversation with the Almighty won't change that." The words hung in the air like smoke, bitter, offensive, and lingering. Marcus raised his head slowly, and though his face remained composed, the wound was visible in his eyes. Not anger, but something deeper. a mix of disappointment and exhaustion, the kind that comes from being reduced once again to less than human in a space that claims to serve justice. He didn't respond. He didn't look away either. He just stood still, letting the weight of the insult land where it would. The room had shifted again, this time from reverence to discomfort. Even the bailiff, who had stood like a statue all morning, glanced sideways at the judge, uneasy. But then something happened. As Judge Weaver reached for the sentencing file, his hand froze midway. His eyes locked onto a handwritten note scribbled along the bottom margin of the final page. His expression changed. He blinked, reread it, then leaned in closer. His face, once smug and stone-like, began to soften in confusion. He flipped a page back, scanning quickly, then returned to the note. Something was unraveling in his mind. Slowly, he looked back up at Marcus, now with hesitation in his voice. You're the same Marcus Bell from the Jefferson Street fire last December? He asked, the sharp edge gone from his tone. The courtroom, sensing the shift, stilled again. You're the man who ran into that burning apartment building and pulled out those two kids? Marcus gave a single nod. Didn't seem important to bring up, he replied quietly. But the moment had already shifted. The judge's eyes flicked back to the note. Marcus Bell risked life-saving minors from structure fire. Awarded Citizens Medal by Fire Department. Injury, second-degree burns, arms and shoulders. Declined media interviews. The judge read it twice, his lips tightening into something unreadable. That story had made local headlines briefly, about a man who had saved lives without giving his name to the press, who had disappeared from the news cycle as quickly as he'd entered it. No one knew then that the man was on parole. No one knew it was this man. A silence swept through the room again, this time heavier. Judge Weaver leaned back slowly in his chair. His fingers, still resting on the edge of the file, trembled slightly. He stared at Marcus, truly stared, as though he were seeing him for the first time, as though the layers of statistics and case numbers had suddenly fallen away, revealing not a defendant, but a man of courage, of character. And then it happened. A flicker of something passed through the judge's eyes, regret perhaps, or shame, and with it came the unmistakable quiver of his lip. He blinked hard, swallowed, but it was too late to hide. His eyes shimmered. A tear formed and rolled slowly down the crease of his cheek. He turned slightly, perhaps to mask it, but the courtroom had already seen. His face had cracked open in front of everyone. The man who just moments earlier mocked a prayer had been pierced by the truth that no paper could capture. The quiet strength of a man who did the right thing when no one was watching. The mockery now sat in the air, like a bitter taste in the back of the throat, unshakable. Judge Weaver wiped the tear quickly, almost angrily, but it didn't matter. The courtroom had seen the moment the stone wall gave way. The silence in the courtroom was no longer just uncomfortable, it was transformative. It lingered like the echo of a bell after it stops ringing, as though no one dared to speak and risk breaking the moment. Judge Weaver didn't say anything right away. He couldn't. His hands were still resting on the file, but his grip had slackened. The mockery in his earlier tone now seemed like an echo from another man entirely. He blinked once, then again, trying to collect himself, but his face betrayed the storm now brewing inside. A face that, after 2 decades of procedural detachment, suddenly looked human, conflicted, and exposed. The weight of what had just happened, the prayer he had dismissed, the man he had reduced, the mocking words he'd spoken so effortlessly, seemed to come crashing down all at once, and that handwritten note, almost missed entirely, now felt like a divine rebuke scribbled on the margins of justice itself. He adjusted in his chair, cleared his throat not out of authority, but discomfort, and glanced again at Marcus, who remained standing with the same quiet strength, eyes steady, posture unchanged. He hadn't asked for sympathy. He hadn't pointed to his injuries or the bravery of his actions. And he certainly hadn't tried to guilt the court into mercy. That was what made it harder to ignore. He hadn't performed for the judge. He had simply stood in truth. Judge Weaver leaned back slowly, pressing a palm to his mouth, his elbow resting on the bench. He looked to the ceiling for a moment as if searching for the right words in the faint, dust-filtered light above. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before, lower, less sure of itself. "Mr. Bell," he said, pausing to swallow, He stopped, as though the sentence was heavier than expected. "I owe you an apology." There was an audible shift in the room, eyebrows raised, even a faint gasp from someone seated in the gallery. This was a judge not known for backing down, let alone admitting fault. "I was wrong to dismiss your words the way I did. It was disrespectful and uncalled for," he continued. "I made an assumption based not on who you are, but on where you stood. That was a failure on my part." Marcus didn't nod, didn't smile. He simply absorbed the moment without gloating, the way someone does when they're too familiar with injustice to take pleasure in small victories. The judge turned to the clerk beside him and whispered something. The clerk leaned over the microphone and said, "Your Honor is requesting a brief recess." The gavel didn't slam. Instead, Judge Weaver rose quietly and disappeared through the chamber door behind him. The courtroom exhaled at once, murmurs breaking out like a wave. Marcus was led back to the defense table, and his young attorney, who had said almost nothing until now, leaned in and whispered, "That doesn't happen. Ever." But Marcus said nothing. His gaze remained on the judge's empty seat. When Judge Weaver returned 15 minutes later, something had clearly changed, not in his clothes or manner, but in his energy. The coldness that had marked his presence before had melted, replaced by a kind of solemn responsibility. He sat down, took a long breath, and then did something no one in that courtroom expected. He didn't reach for the sentencing form. Instead, he reopened the file and said, "Let the record reflect that the court has reviewed the full context of Mr. Bell's circumstances, including recent acts of civic bravery that were previously omitted from official documents." Another pause. "The court will be issuing a formal statement of commendation for Mr. Bell's actions on December 18th. Furthermore, this court finds sufficient reason to suspend the technical violation pending a full community hearing." The room didn't erupt, but something deeper than applause filled the space. A sense of rightness, of justice remembered, not just administered. Marcus's jaw tightened, not from pride, but from the emotional strain of a moment he'd never expected. His hands folded again, this time resting calmly in his lap. Judge Weaver, voice steady now, looked him in the eye. "I hope you'll accept my apology not just as a judge, but as a man." Marcus met his gaze, and for the first time, the smallest nod passed between them. Not of forgiveness, but of mutual recognition. Two men from different worlds, momentarily joined by the fragile, powerful thread of truth. The courtroom eventually emptied, but for Judge Ronald Weaver, the weight of that moment refused to leave with the people. Long after the bailiff announced the adjournment and the last footsteps echoed out into the hallway, he remained seated at the bench, staring not at the file in front of him, but at the empty space where Marcus Bell had stood. He sat in silence, his fingertips pressed together beneath his chin, lost in thought not about legal precedent or judicial procedure, but about a man's quiet dignity in the face of mockery, a dignity that revealed far more about character than any record ever could. For the first time in his career, Weaver didn't feel like the judge in the room. He felt judged, not by the law, but by a moment that had stripped away his robe and revealed the man beneath it. Later that evening, in the privacy of his chambers, he reopened the file, not out of obligation, but out of a desire to understand. He read every line again, slowly this time, not scanning for violations, but looking between the lines. There were missed parole check-ins, yes, but there were also documented 12-hour work shifts, supervisor commendations, and letters from co-workers describing Marcus as quiet, reliable, and the kind of man who stays late to clean up even when he's not asked. One note from a mechanic named Alonzo read, "Marcus helped my son get clean. He didn't just talk to him. He showed up every Sunday, never missed one. Just sat with him. Talked to him like he mattered." And then there were hospital records, handwritten notes from the children's parents, one of whom, as the judge discovered, had tried to contact the court multiple times to speak on Marcus's behalf, but their statement had never made it through the backlog. The deeper Judge Weaver read, the more he realized how blind he had been. not just to Marcus, but to how the system itself filtered out the full stories of people like him, reducing lives into violations and technicalities. That night, unable to sleep, he found himself pacing through his home, haunted not by guilt alone, but by a new, unfamiliar urgency. The next morning, he arrived at the courthouse earlier than usual, and did something unheard of in his two-decade career. He requested Marcus Bell's presence in his chambers. When Marcus arrived, wearing the same scuffed shoes and work jacket he'd come to court in the day before, he entered slowly, unsure of what awaited him. Judge Weaver stood as he came in, a small gesture, but one that did not go unnoticed. The judge extended his hand, and Marcus, after a brief pause, shook it. It was the kind of handshake that held no pretense, just the raw truth of two men recognizing the distance they'd crossed in silence. Weaver invited him to sit. For the next hour, they didn't speak about court procedures or violations. They spoke about life, about second chances, about how Marcus had learned to pray in prison because it was the only place he could be quiet enough to hear his own thoughts. He spoke about the fire, not to boast, but because the judge asked. And he spoke about how tired he was, not from work, but from being reduced again and again to nothing more than the worst version of himself that someone else had written on paper. Judge Weaver listened, not as a judge, but as a man confronting the mirror. And when the conversation ended, he handed Marcus something unusual, not paperwork, but a letter. It was addressed to the State Parole Board, signed by the judge himself, recommending full early release and citing extraordinary personal transformation, civic heroism, and moral integrity in the face of systemic failure. Marcus said nothing at first. His fingers trembled slightly as he held the envelope. "You didn't have to do this," he finally said. The judge replied quietly, "No, but I should have a long time ago. Men like you don't need to beg for justice. It's the system that needs to learn how to see you properly." A week later, the release was granted. The story of Marcus Bell, though never publicized widely, traveled through the quiet circles that mattered. Parole officers began looking a little more closely before filing violations. A few judges quietly revised how they approached defendants who prayed instead of pleaded. But for Marcus, the biggest change came in the silence. No more holding his breath walking into a courtroom. No more wondering if doing the right thing would ever matter. He kept working at the garage. He volunteered at a local youth center. He still prayed, quietly, without performance. But now when he did, he wasn't asking to endure judgment. He was giving thanks for the day that one man's mockery turned into a moment of revelation. As for Judge Weaver, he changed too. Not overnight, but irrevocably. That courtroom bench never felt the same again. And whenever someone dared to pray before him again, he never interrupted, he listened. Because he had learned the hard way that sometimes the most powerful truths don't come in legal briefs or closing arguments. They come in whispers, in silence, and in the kind of faith that doesn't demand to be seen, but refuses to be mocked. In the end, this wasn't just a story about a courtroom, a judge, or a parole hearing. It was a story about how one man's quiet dignity had the power to disrupt a system that had long forgotten how to listen. Marcus Bell didn't raise his voice, he didn't argue, and he didn't beg. All he did was pray, and in doing so, he forced a man hardened by decades of routine to stop and see what he had missed for far too long. That true strength doesn't always come in loud declarations or legal brilliance. It often comes from stillness, from humility, from the courage to stand in truth even when the world expects you to shrink. Judge Weaver, a man who once saw prayers in court as distractions, left that encounter with a shaken sense of self, but also a renewed understanding of justice, one that no legal training had ever taught him. And for Marcus, who had walked into that room expecting yet another mark against his name, he walked out not just with his freedom, but with something far greater, his dignity intact, his spirit seen, and a moment that would echo far beyond that courtroom. Because sometimes all it takes is a quiet voice, whispered in faith, to shake the walls of the proud and remind us all. Justice isn't about power, it's about humanity.